Welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. I'm Gerry Scott, founder of the Snowbirds US Day Tracker and the Canada Physical Presence Tracker app. Hello, everybody. Today's guest, we have Oliver Branch. He's the Director of Immigration Law for Moody's Private Client Law. A little bit about Oliver, and I'm going to get Oliver to tell us his story on how he got from North Carolina to Toronto. But a little bit about Oliver. He's got 15 years of experience playing key roles in some of the world's leading immigration law firms, international global mobility consulting groups. Oliver is uniquely qualified to provide U.S. legal advice in all areas of U.S. immigration law and related global mobility services. He has extensive experience in assisting organizations from startups to Fortune 100 companies across varying industries in developing and maintaining successful global immigration and global mobility programs. Some of Oliver's professional affiliations: he has been the vice chair for the American Lawyers Association, the Canadian chapter for 2021-2022 term, and the American Immigration Lawyers Association executive board member from 2011 to 2014. The point we're making here is on today's topic, we've got the right person filling us in with all these confusing questions around U.S. immigration. So, Oliver, how did you get from North Carolina to Toronto?
They ran me out. No, it makes me sound a lot fancier than I am, that description. But
you wrote it.
Well, I wrote it to make me sound fancy, right? Mama taught me right. But I grew up in North Carolina, went to law school in Virginia, and practiced in big firms there. But got recruited by the Big Four in 2008 to come up and manage a U.S. practice, and stayed in that for a while until I realized I wasn't actually talking to clients very often and coming up with creative strategies the way I like. So I joined Moody's, a private client, where I get to kind of work with clients one-on-one every day, coming up with creative strategies for everything from snowbirds to companies. But that really sweet spot are individuals who are spending a little bit of time down in the U.S., going back and forth from Canada, and need to make sure they're doing it the right way.
Well, I'll tell you, today's topic, basically we're talking about the myth of the 30-day rule for snowbirds. If you leave the country, if you leave the United States and come back to Canada, will your I-94 reset? And we'll also be discussing the rolling 12-month calendar that snowbirds are talking about all the time. And Oliver, I got to tell you, I get this through our app, the Snowbird US Day Tracker app. The number one questions we're receiving is that 30-day rule and also the rolling calendar schedule. Does it exist? So right from the top, what can you help solve these problems? I know there's a lot of people listening today, so you're the man. Give us the wealth, give us the education here.
I think one of the biggest confusing parts of it for Canadians are that, for the most part, Canadians are visa exempt for the most part. So the difference between visa and status, which is what they grant you when they admit you at the border, is a visa is a travel document that allows you to travel to the United States. But when they grant you admission to the U.S. to I-94 at the border or at the airport, that's status. And those two things are quite different. The 30-day rule, it does apply across the board, but it's not quite what it seems. And it was originally meant for the visa element, kind of interplaying with that. But one of the hardest parts is that the officers at the border have discretion, so it's not consistently applied. So that's a little bit confusing, but it doesn't really limit you. The way it really works in practice is this way. Say if you're a snowbird and you jump on the plane in Calgary and you fly down to Florida, and when they admit you in Calgary to the United States, they give you 6 months usually, right? 6 months time. And say you're in there for 4 months, and then you take a quick trip down to Puerto Vallarta. You want to go lay on the beach, and you travel down to Puerto Vallarta for 2 weeks, and you come back into the United States. The officer's CBP has the discretion of just making the old I-94, the one that they gave you when you flew in from Calgary, valid again. So it's not a full new 6 months. It would have been whatever that remaining time was. So, for example, let's put dates to it. You entered on January 1st from Calgary. They granted you 6 months in the United States. In late April, you decide to go to Puerto Vallarta. for a couple of weeks and you're re-entering at the end of May or in the middle of May, they have the option to just give you status. So you put, just because you were gone for less than 30 days up to that original 6 month period at the end of June. Or they could not apply it and you could be given a much longer period of time, say another 6 months. The part where people get really tripped up is that because you were out for a bit and you re-entered, you have to make sure you know your date. You're responsible for knowing. So if your status ends at the end of June and you enter in May thinking you have 6 months and you keep on staying, you have overstayed your status in the United States, and that could be a really big problem for you. The other area kind of applies it for like an E2 visa holder, which you all don't need to know, but it's an investment visa for entrepreneurs. Sometimes the visa may be expiring on June 1st, but you enter the day before, and they give you a couple of months. When you exit the US for less than 30 days, they could revalidate the I-94, or you could have to go get the visa. But that's not something that generally snowbirds have to deal with.
Now, do you find that I-94, I know when I'm traveling back and forth to Maui, you don't really see the I-94. You have to go online, the border crossing website, and apply for it. But for some reason, I believe the last time I went across, they actually gave me a little ticket.
Yes. And that used to be the way. So before a few years ago, a lot of times they would put the little card and it would say I-94 and it would have an expiration date and a stamp. A few years ago, they decided to go paperless, which really meant they weren't going to give you the card anymore, but they expected for you to go online and print it out. Funny thing is even if they give you a card, it is not controlling. The online one is. So sometimes people will get a card that's good for 3 months, but online it's good for 2 months. The online controls. And so I always advise clients every time you enter the United States, just go to your search engine of choice and type in I-94 and you'll see the site come up. And you can pull your most recent entry and it'll show you when your status expires, and that's controlling. You can also pull up your travel history, which will show usually every entry you've made on your passport to the United States and when you left. But the warning I'll give you, and you might already know this, is that it's not always consistent. Sometimes Customs and Border Protection will not put it in there when you enter the US, and they'll not put it in there when you exit. So it's very, very important that you keep travel records. You know the dates that you entered. And I always advise people to get a credit card receipt on before they enter and right after they enter, because that's a clear record of the date that you entered, and do the same thing when you leave. That way, if you're ever questioned, you didn't overstay, you have evidence of when you left or came in.
Okay, I didn't know that. I really did not know that's probably a great way, because I know when people do cross the border, they've always asked for, they tell people to carry some kind of identification, a hydro bill from Canada or a telephone bill from Canada, just to have additional backup if you're being questioned, where is your principal residence?
Well, and that's really getting at the two legal questions that everyone has to be able to evidence when they enter the US as a visitor. One is, what are you doing while you're down there as a visitor? Because you can't be working for a US company. You can lay on the beach, you can go to Vegas with the guys, you can do a lot of things, but you can't work. And the second legal element is your intent temporary? Do you have ties to home country? So the things you're talking about, documents of utility bills or your home in Canada, those are evidence of your ties to Canada, that your primary residence is Canada, and that you're not staying down there permanently, you're coming back. Other good evidence is a round trip plane ticket. That's quite helpful to show. And if you're going down to visit family or to a conference, have that evidence of that so they can see what you're doing and don't think you're working.
Now, what is the definition of working when you're down in the States? And let's say, I guess it's kind of two questions here. One is the definition of what you are working. If you're just communicating through Zoom conferencing, or if you're talking to the office or calls into the office, that's one question, the definition. And the second question is that it seems like more and more people are working from remote areas. And is a Canadian, if they are in United States and they're working for their employer and they're picking up the phone as if they were in their office, is that something people should really be cautious about?
It's a great question, and it's kind of a gray area that was there, but COVID made it so much bigger, and the legal policy and law hasn't caught up with it yet in a real true way. So here's the way I advise people. As a visitor to the United States, you are allowed to do things like meetings, conferences, trade shows, contract negotiations. Those are all allowed. When a Canadian enters the US as a visitor, that's B2, like boy 2, or it's the status. That means visitor for pleasure. But it's the same entry as if you're a business visitor, which is B1. So again, those are permissible activities: conferences, trade shows, business meetings, contract negotiations. Those are all allowed. That fits most of the things that you're talking about. If it goes beyond that, beyond that where you're doing a whole lot of work, it's kind of in a gray area where immigration law hasn't caught up. You certainly don't want to be doing that for a U.S. employer or for a U.S. client or customer. But if it's purely the Canadian employer, purely Canadian customers or clients, it's a bit of a gray area there. Where you may start to run into trouble is not an immigration law issue, but a tax law issue. That could become the problem. But as of right now, immigration law and policy has not shocking, has not caught up with the current atmosphere.
So I guess that kind of leads me to the point is that do you see in the future we might see a mobility visa, a whole different classification?
I mean, I think we will. There's already some of those out there for, say, companies on both sides of the border, or those that fit neatly in the TN category under the, if you're in Canada, it's CUSMA. If you're in the US, it's USMCA. It used to be NAFTA. I would imagine at some point here, they're going to find a way to regulate it. One, because, if you can do a job from anywhere nowadays, what does that mean? But I think it'll be more about tax than anything else. Is really going to get it because they want to get us, bring that tax revenue in and catch it all. I sit on an advisory committee for the U.S. Senate on comprehensive immigration reform, and there's a lot of discussion on this, but it's a very difficult dance to not stifle business and not stifle what the treaty is supposed to allow, which is this cross-border business, and collect tax revenue and make sure that they're protecting U.S. workers. It's a very fine line, and I don't see a solution to it anytime soon.
Now, the question here is coming from the tax point of view. Now, we know that that Canadians, snowbirds that go down south, they have that 3-year rule where they have to prove they've got closer ties to Canadian soil than U.S. soil, that 183-day calculation. Now, what happens if a person enters the country through the B1 visa? Are those days exempt from the 183?
No, they're not. And you and I have talked about this a little before. The immigration count and tax count are very different. They aren't the same. But any day that you're in the United States as a visitor counts towards that calculation for either immigration or tax. No exclusion from that. There are certain immigration categories where exclusions are there. Some of for diplomats, for some trainees, but for a visitor, no. You need to count that, and you need to count the day that you're traveling on either end. They count the day traveling to or from the U.S. count as days in the U.S.
Well, when I think of all the questions that we receive, and everybody has their opinion, and I think the scary thing is that immigration is tax is always kind of intertwined, and Canadians are sitting around campfires down in the States, and they're arguing over it's 180, it's 183, it's the 30-day rule, go home for 30 days and come back into the country. So I think this podcast and having you as a guest on this podcast is going to be very, very helpful for us. I think we're going to reduce the calls from 50 a week down to hopefully less than 10. Now, the other thing that's really, really confusing out there is that, and we've elected not to put it on our app, and it's called the 12. It's called the rolling calendar. And when people say that it's 100 and, once again, we're getting back to this I-94 and the confusion around discretion of these border crossing agents. What can you tell me about the 12, the rolling calendar schedule? Does it exist?
It exists in tax, not in immigration. So there is a rolling calculation for figuring tax residency under the treaty. My mom said I was only good at one thing, and it was immigration, so I won't speak to tax. But in immigration, it's really confusing because a lot of times officers at the border will tell a Canadian, you can only be in the U.S. 6 months a year. That's not quite true. There's no actual limit per year that a Canadian can be a visitor in the United States. Usually when a Canadian enters, they give you 6 months. Years ago, before that, they wouldn't stamp Canadians at all, and it was considered a year right off the bat. But I have some Canadians that have entered the US, say before COVID, for they got the 6 months, but they couldn't travel because of medical conditions during COVID. And so we extended their visitor status. We could do it right before it expired. We filed for a 6 month extension, and we filed for a couple more. So they've been there for a couple of years as visitors lawfully. The issue becomes this: immigrant intent, that ties to home country, that temporary intent issue. If you've been in the US for 6 months and then you filed for a visitor extension on time with the US Immigration Service and stayed a few more months, say 9 months, and then you leave for even 45 days, forgetting the 30-day issue, but 45 days, and then try to come right back in, the officer may not see it and catch it. But if they do see how long you've been in there, they're going to ask you questions around your temporary intent. And some officers have such a strict view on it that they may say, you need to stay out for, they say all kinds of things. And not that it's just their interpretation. So sometimes they'll say, oh, you need to stay out for 6 months before you can come back in. That's more of their discretion than the actual rules. But that's where it really comes back to bite you, is if you've been there for a long time and you leave for a short period, they're starting to believe that your intent isn't temporary and you're actually living in the United States, residing in the United States as an intending immigrant instead of as the visitor that you claimed when you entered. That can be a bit of a problem. It can keep you from getting in. And it can also, if they think that you lied when you entered, that you really intended on staying a long time, they could say that you committed fraud and misrep, which could be a permanent bar from the U.S. So it's not something you want to fool around with. I always tell a client, if they've been in there for a while and they extended their status, the next time they enter, they want to have a package from someone like me that says this is why they were there, this is what they were doing, this is their residence in Canada, and all the evidence that they don't intend on immigrating to the U.S. And here's what they're going back in for. And that tends to work, but it is a fine dance with the officers.
Did you find that during COVID, I know we had friends that kind of got caught in Maui and stayed an extended period of time. Was the U.S. a little bit more friendlier towards that, or did you see people really get themselves in trouble, or was it just a time that they had to manage?
It wasn't that big of a deal. And you have two different agencies that we're dealing with. Inside the U.S., you're dealing with USCIS. That's the Internal Immigration Service. Used to be the INS a long time ago. And at the border is CBP. And they don't agree about a lot, most things. So the Internal Immigration Service, we would file visitor extensions, and they were great with it. It was all fine. They understood. It made sense. And at the border, CBP didn't always take that same, if someone had been in for 8 months and left, they're saying, why are you going back if you might get trapped again, right? But it just depended on the officer. They were a little bit more concerned with the question around vaccination and testing at that moment and less about time.
Now, when I hear that you're involved with all these things like the vice chair for the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Canada chapter for the terms of 2022.
Chair now.
Oh, you're the chair. You're the big kahuna.
Yeah, the big kahuna is a very small pond, but yes.
Okay. Well, I guess that really brings up what's before Congress these days, is that we're always hearing that Canadians could have 7 months, 8 months. What have you been hearing that's going to get people really excited about? Forgetting what we just said for the last 20 minutes.
Again, I have seen it. So I've been on this committee for advising for quite a long time. Back when I first started doing it in 2009, or 2007, it was Biden and McCain and all these different people were the Gang of Eight, Gang of Nine. We're working on this. And I'll tell you a secret. Don't tell anyone. Both parties agree on most immigration things. We would sit in committees where they would all agree. They just won't say it out loud outside of that room. But most of them are in favor of extending the period of time Canadians can be in the United States, because it means you're down there spending money and paying, sales tax and all that thing in the state. So I believe that will be coming down the road. The issue is it's hard to get them to agree or pass anything during an election year. And it seems like recently election years go on for years and years. But I do expect some of that to be there. I also expect for some more categories to kind of expand. For example, the E2 investor category that a lot of snowbirds that we work with kind of look to that to expand their time in the U.S., and some other avenues for people that make passive investments in the U.S. So the E2 are for people that buy active businesses or start them, but a passive investment, say buying real estate down there, that's your rent out or even your second home, to kind of encourage that investment, passive investment in the U.S. There's some talk about creating a category that would allow people to be there a little longer, as long as they have those investments in the United States.
Now, Canada just passed, they had that no foreign buyers in Canada for a 2-year period. The Americans have nothing like that whatsoever, nor would they ever consider it.
On a state level, maybe in California, but nowhere else. I know they won't. I mean, as an American, I can say we're mostly stop. Don't tell us what to do with our stuff or our property, but I don't really see that occurring in most areas. I could see maybe some local sales tax or property taxes being impacted that way. I think we'll have to see how it works here in Canada. Maybe Canada's the test engine for how I live in Toronto. I'd like to see the real estate prices come down a bit, but I'm not sure that's the avenue to get there.
I mean, if that was the one of the intentions in Vancouver was the vacancy tax and different things, so you kind of wonder when you have places like Maui, where it's becoming very, very expensive for the locals to find housing, and meanwhile these Canadian places are either being rented out or sitting vacant for, probably 5, 6, 7, 8 months of the year. So it's really interesting to see if that ever comes
But
down.
Maui also survives off of foreign investment in tourism. So I think you'll see that a little bit where tourism is a major part of the economy. I think they'd be less likely to do anything that would restrict foreign investors.
So just to kind of summarize before we get into a few other things here. So the bottom line is the 30-day rule. It once again, it's discretion, so it doesn't exist, or people have to be kind of careful with it.
It does exist. It's just not as strictly applied. The key thing to remember, don't worry as much about the 30-day rule. Worry about this. Each time you enter the US, pull your I-94 status document and make sure you know the date that expires. That'll tell you whether they applied it or not, but that's the most important thing. You can extend that status in the US. So that's when you need to call an immigration lawyer like my team that can help extend it. But the most important thing, 30-day or not, 6 months or not in the US, is that you need to know what that online I-94 says for you.
Now, there's also regarding that I-94 is that you can apply ahead of time. If you're planning to drive across, you can apply ahead of time for your I-94.
You can. I tell you, I have been doing this long enough that I don't have a ton of faith in the systems when they first apply them. The digital, it's pretty easy. They could just do that right at the port. So it's not that big of a deal when you're entering, but we're following it. We'll see how well it gets applied. Like when they went to digital on the I-94 instead of the paper one, lots of times people will call me and say, there's no record of my entry at all. I went in there and it doesn't show that I entered, but I'm here and I'm in Florida. And there's something you have to do to correct that. There's a way to correct it. And that's why you have those credit card receipts, but that's really important. Right now, I wouldn't put my faith in the online system. I would stick with the porter where an officer looks at you in the face and make sure they stamp you, but it is an option.
It's interesting. As I was preparing for our call today, I went online and it cost $6 to apply ahead of time for your I-94. So I can't imagine them getting rich or paying down their debt with the $6 I-94 request. And I guess the other thing is really if a person that 12-month rolling calendar schedule, and you say that's more based on the tax side of it than it is on the immigration side.
It is. The funny thing is I could go in the US through 5 different ports in one day, or send people through, and every officer will say something different in regards to that. But the actual law says that you are generally admitted for 6 months when you enter, but a visitor can be there as long as the status is valid and it's granted. An example of that would be when same-sex marriage was legal in Canada, but not in the US. When you would do like a work visa to transfer an employee to the US, they changed the law to allow that same-sex partner, as long as the marriage was valid in Canada, to enter as a visitor, and they could stay with them for 7 years as a visitor. They just had to keep extending it every 6 months. So you certainly can be there for longer as a visitor, but you just have to realize that's going to impact the next time you enter, and you're going to need to make sure you have your documents in a row.
Now, I guess the other thing is when we're going across the border, do you find that people that are in their 60s can have an easier time going across the border?
A lot of
Because
times you will. A lot of times you certainly will. And, nice smiling and they've seen maybe a history. Say when they grab your passport, they look in and they see a quite a long history of coming in and out and following the rules. I would say certainly an easier time than an 18-year-old.
okay, yeah, okay. Well, I guess the other thing we have is um, oh, I was just thinking about when people do go across the border. I've always told people, even with myself, we've created this app, and I'm fortunate enough to know guys like Oliver that we can talk about immigration all day long, if we choose to. Um, Even myself going across the border, I do not try and act like a know-it-all going across the border. I'm on my best behavior. I try and, if it's possible for me to give one-word answers, that is my goal when I go across. What can you add to that?
I always joke that whether you're talking to a judge, a police officer, an immigration officer, or your spouse, we usually get in trouble when we over answer the question. So answer the questions that are asked politely and concisely. Don't keep talking thinking that will help you. That's usually how people get in trouble. Also, it doesn't matter whether they're terribly rude to you. You're never going to get anywhere by being anything but absolutely polite with them. And also know that you have the right to ask to withdraw your application for admission. So if you're there at the border at the airport and the questions start going where you think, well, this is not going well, I don't think they're going to let me in. You absolutely have the right to say, you know what, I would like to withdraw my application for admission and come back another day when I make sure I have the right documents. They usually will allow you to do that. It doesn't show as a denial or a problem in the system. You can circle back out of there, call someone like me, and we'll talk you through it. But you want to be polite. You want to be careful with joking. I always tell people that I had it when cannabis was first legalized in Canada and it was a big deal at the border. I had a client that was entering as a visitor, and the officer at the border said, "So do you smoke cannabis?" And he joked, "Not today." And he was barred from the country permanently. So joking, not always a good idea. Be absolutely respectful. And also don't assume you know the political leanings of an officer at the border. You never quite know. So I always keep that out of it. But I always joke with people that system is designed to make you nervous. The setting is designed to, I'm an ombudsman and liaison to many of those ports, and I feel nervous when I go through, and I'm an American citizen entering the US. So it's designed that way.
That brings up a great question. We've always had, I'm sure a lot of people have been on that golf trip with, 12 to 16 guys, and you're heading down south, and we've all got the story that one of the 16 guys has some past offense of, playing around with his cannabis and sorry boys, denied entry. Do you get a lot of those calls, these guys trying to correct something they did when they were in 21 and now they're in their 60s?
We do, and here's why that's happening. After September 11th, we yelled at people on both, you're not sharing information, you're not sharing data. And so over the years, as they started digitizing more things and sharing them under these treaties, there's a lot of people that have entered thousands of times over the years and never had an issue. And all of a sudden, an officer will say, "Hold on a second, I see a DUI from 1974 on your record." That's a problem. One is they're just going to see you to go get the court record, and there's ways to get around that, ways to get through either way. But what could be a problem is if they look to a prior entry and the officer asked you whether you'd ever been arrested or charged with anything, and you said no, and now they have it, they can accuse you years later of fraud and misrep and bar you from the U.S. So you always want to answer that question honestly, but really, if you've ever had any kind of look. I no judgment, right? There's lots of people who've had issues. If you ever had a drunk tank night when you were in university or a possession charge, talk to someone like me and plan it the right way. If you have one possession charge, it's not going to keep you out, but you need to plan for it, have the documentation ready, and make sure you answer the questions the right way.
Well, Oliver, we've taken a lot of your time away from a very, very busy schedule, I'm sure. So I truly appreciate you coming on with us, and I'm sure this is probably going to be one of our favorite podcasts, and we look forward to having you back. But in the short term, they can reach out through the Snowbird US Day Tracker. Oliver and I communicate on a at least a weekly basis here. So if we can ever point you in Oliver's direction, we definitely will. So, Oliver, thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Anything for you, buddy. Have a great day, everyone.
Okay. Thank you for listening to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. Our app is available for your iPhone and your Android. If you have any questions, call me 604-612-7526. Until our next podcast, I'm Gerry Scott.